Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Ben Ramsden. I work with Digital Catapult, and I'm going to be the host for today. We're super excited about all of the attendees for this event. There's a really large number of people that have signed up for the event, and we've got a really exciting panel from industry, leaders from across the sector who are going to be talking to us today about why and how the UK food and drink industry should be able to lead the way when it comes to digitalizing supply chains. So just going to wait for a few minutes or so until until everyone signs up for the event, or those signed up join us at the event. But this is part of a new series of events that are being run by Digital Catapult, where we bring together leaders from across industry to help set the tone and set the framing for the work that needs to happen when we look at innovation across the sector. So as mentioned, today we're looking at why and how the UK food and drink industry should lead the way when it comes to digitizing supply chains. And we're looking forward to this event being hopefully the beginning of a new dialogue with industry for us here at Digital Catapult. So just to run through a bit of housekeeping before we get started, the event will be recorded, so any of your peers who aren't able to make the event today will be able to see it online. So we're going to be posting it on YouTube. With the Q&A, you'll see at the bottom of your screen there's a Q&A box, so please do add any questions into the Q&A so that we can basically hear your voices and hear what you guys need to say about these issues. And likewise with the chat box, you'll be able to put comments in there. And then at the end of each of the panel sessions, we'll be able to pass those questions to some of the panelists if we have time. If we don't have time, we'll be able to follow those up in the communication that comes at the end of the event. We've got a really great discussion that we're going to be having today about digital supply chains. But I'm just going to frame it now by saying what we actually mean by digital supply chains. So there's many definitions out there, but ultimately what we're talking about here, just in simple language, is where advanced technologies replace analog and paper-based technologies to generate these real-time analysis from data that significantly improves the flows of products and money. And this generally means that first we digitalize information and then can digitalize processes, which helps us to drive optimized operations, resilient networks, and new data-driven business models. And this whole new world that's coming to supply chains is really being enabled by digitalization. And driving sustainability and greater resilience, more agility across the systems. But also we need to understand what the boundaries are. And today, when we're discussing this, we're going to be looking at holistically at the end-to-end system. So this means we're going to be working across all tiers talking about across all tiers from agriculture, manufacture, logistics, and retail. And whereas the UK has a very large and vibrant food and drink system, most supply chains have international connections too, and so we must understand these within this context. So that's the general topics of what we're going to be discussing, and we're going to start off with a keynote that really helps to set the precedent. This is by Ian Noble, Head of Research and Productivity at Mondelez International. We're then going to go into a discussion around how we can enable this shift and what needs to be done and how can it be funded, which will be led by Chris Tyers from GS1. And then Rudiger Hagedorn is going to, from Consumer Goods Forum, is going to be helping the panel discuss what are the key strengths that the UK has, and why do we have such a great opportunity to move the needle and move things forward when it comes to digital supply chains. And then we're going to sum up with some actions around what we do next. So without further ado, I'd like to now pass over to Ian at Mondelez International, who will be able to give us a talk through how we set the precedent for moving forward. So Ian, over to you.
That's great. Thanks, Ben. Load the slides up. Okay. And could you just give me a thumbs up if we're okay? Can people see if we're sharing?
Perfect. All great.
Okay, that's great. Okay, in which case let's get cracking, yeah, because the time is now, I think, is probably the most appropriate phrase. So when we look at where we are today and why does the UK need to act to digitalise supply chains, I think with the likes of what we're seeing with COVID, with Brexit, with climate change, with increasing urbanisation, and the pressures that are coming on to the food system, both within the UK and globally, we really do need to act. And we're in a pretty much a unique position from a UK, from how we're configured, how we operate, and the depth of capabilities that we have. I think that personally, I believe the challenge is how we bring those together and address the digital challenge and digital opportunity that we have before us. So let's step in and let's go. There we go. So just for those of you who may not be completely aware of quite really what the food and drink manufacturing sector looks like in the UK, it's a bit of a silent star really in many ways. There's a very large number of businesses, vast majority of them are small, but there's large scale as well. The gross value add to the economy is around about £22 billion just from manufacturing of food and drink. It's a large amount of the turnover. It is the largest manufacturing sector, with perhaps also the smallest voice, I might say. And interestingly, when we think about it, we have to look at it from a systematic point of view, because something approaching 2/3 of UK farm production goes through food and drink manufacturing on its way to consumers. The vast majority of the products which come off of the farms, the orchards, the fisheries in the UK go through some degree of processing before we ultimately consume them. And it's important to recognise that the whole joined up nature of the system, for the materials and ingredients that we source from within the UK and those that we source from other countries around the world, the whole piece needs to come together and needs to work. And the degree of interconnectedness and interdependency is phenomenally high. From an employment position, it's about, roughly speaking, about 400,000 people, approximately the population of Leicester, just working in food and drink manufacturing. And as with many of us, we also looking at a potential recruitment gap that we need to address. And I think this is one of the opportunities as well, clearly, where digitisation has a role to play, and building out the digital infrastructure of the food system that enables this whole component system to work is required if we're going to be able to manage the complexity of the system. I think that's critical if we're going to achieve the public good that we all aspire to. And so when we look at it, we really have to remember that the system that we're operating within, and this is a graphic that I've used previously from a group called Shift N, because I think it just lays out the complexity of how our food system operates today. And you can see in here, whilst at the center we have feed and food flowing through livestock to consumers onto the right hand side, the whole thing joins up and it links through economies, demographics, science, technology, the environment, systems. It genuinely is a highly complex, highly interdependent system, which to some level might seem a bit, oh, wow, that's it's perhaps surprising, but at the same time, this in a sense is fundamentally the basis for life. But without this system, we're in a situation where we can't feed ourselves. So getting this right is vital, because if we get it, because we have to, there is no plan B in terms of this. This has to be done. And so as we work our way through this, I think it's useful to just reflect on where we've been and where we're going. So looking at the current situation, and then we'll move into the opportunity space. If you look at the population growth from 1970 to now, we've gone up by, well, roughly speaking, 4 billion people. And those are people that are still getting fed. And I'm aware that, as many of us will be, there are challenges in that system. Not everyone is getting fed equally, and there are challenges, but we have managed to keep that going. From an affordability point of view, and this is one of the points I think which we do need to recognize, is that the journey for the majority of the 20th century was primarily focused on the availability of food and the affordability of food. And the journey that's been achieved is the progress has been that's seen the food move from 30% of take-home pay in the UK back in the 1920s for the average family down to approximately 10% of income today for many families. Certainly for most of us on the call, that will be the case. Clearly, there are other families that are in a different situation. And that's why I called out the US situation here, where at an average level, it's at around about equally at about 10% of income. But for the poorest fifth of the population, some statistics that they've just released show that it can be up to 35% of income. So affordability, whilst there's been tremendous progress on it, still remains an area of focus and must continue to be so, as must availability. Food safety and quality. A lot of the work that has happened in the last century really addressed the challenges that we have seen around food safety, to the extent that in many cases now people aren't even aware of the challenges and how the system used to operate. Productivity within the UK, we've seen an uplift since about 2015 of about 11%. And sustainability, it's important to recognise that about 70% of the UK's land mass alone is feeding into the food system in the UK, and we contribute about 25% of greenhouse gas emissions, which in the context of one of the basic staples that enables us to survive, I don't think is surprisingly high. I think for me that makes a lot of sense as to where it is. And a lot of this has been driven by urbanisation, which is one of the key economic changes we've seen through the last century. So in terms of opportunities, clearly productivity and the need to increase and step up on productivity is there. Aerospace are looking like they've delivered something in the region of 30%. I think that's a clear challenge for us. In terms of the sustainability, we have a target of carbon neutrality. And for us to be able to get to that as a food system level, we need to be able to understand the interdependencies between the systems nodes so that we can actually make the right choices, so that we can build and continue the journey on sustainable intensification within agriculture, decarbonisation of manufacturing, so the whole pieces begin to come together. Because for many of you will be aware, 60 to 70% of the embedded carbon within the food that we consume is actually, if you do the life cycle analysis, that sits within the fields and the farms. That's where that's going in. And so by far the largest amount of the virtual water that's associated with the products, with the foods that we eat, again, is going in agriculture. So it's about how do we address those challenges? How do we make the right choices? So we're choosing and using the right ingredients and moving the whole system to optimize itself to where we need to be. And that degree of join up requires substantial amounts of data connectivity and digitization. Clearly, food waste is a challenge. It's around about 30%, and that's interesting. Depending on where you look around the world, the figure appears to be similar. I'm just referring here to the FAO data. Where it shows up in the system tends to be different. So within developed countries, it's predominantly in the consumer end of the system, whereas in developing countries, a lot of the challenge sits with farm into the system. So it's mostly with losses post-harvest. So there are challenges which need to be addressed, and they're different challenges depending on where we are. Clearly, one of the topics which is very much front of center of mind is always nutrition. And the challenge, it seems to me, as we go into this century is how do we move the foods that we consume and that people are choosing to buy, how do we move those into balance with our modern lifestyles and the demographics that we have to make sure that people are eating what they need to be eating. Clearly, food safety and quality needs to continue. That has to remain as a basic requirement for all of us and the work that we do. And clearly availability and affordability, as I mentioned, we have to keep that front of mind. And the real challenge for me is that how do we put this all together? So we've just had the National Food Strategy. We know that food and drink is clearly a part, as I've just talked through, a much larger part of the economy. It's a much larger part of, in a sense, our nation as well, because it feeds into healthcare, transportation, logistics, energy, utilities, retail. Food and drink is right at the heart of our lives, our economy, and our country. And so we have to be able to move to a joined up set of data, a digital connectivity that enables us to understand the system and the food system that we operate and live within, and how we all contribute to that and move it forward in the right direction, particularly because we need to be able to address the challenges and the targets that are coming forward in terms of net zero, in terms of leveling up, and in terms of building back better. And the challenge, as it seems to me, is as we look forward, we're seeing a time now where the digital agenda, from my mind, and the tools which are available to us are actually starting to converge. And I think this is creating an opportunity for us to begin to look and ask ourselves, okay, the capability that we now have in digital is enabling us to be able to get our arms around the system level thinking that we need to be able to do, to then be able to answer and address the questions, whilst ensuring that we get safe, affordable, nutritious food onto everyone's plates and drive that agenda forward, delivering the targets that we need to. So from my point of view, that we need to now use this event as a starting point, and we build from here as the UK connectivity that we have and the environment that we have and the ecosystem that we have and the ability to innovate, because the UK, one of our strengths is the ability to innovate and to create new possibilities. And to really now it's to come together. It's really a call to action across the UK to create a digital food system that's open, it's interoperable, and it's therefore capable of managing and navigating both challenges, opportunities, and shocks. And I think for many of us, I think we feel that the time is now, the time is here. And that's why I think this workshop that Ben and the team at DigiCatapult have put together is so timely, because I think it will give us the opportunity to come together, to discuss, to build out a dialogue, and then to shape and to lead that going forwards. So Ben and the team, thank you very much for pulling us together and for giving us the opportunity to work on this.
Ian, thank you so much. That's a really great framing of the discussion today. And yes, the time is now. I think we've got a huge amount of overview there about the opportunities and the potential and what this new digital infrastructure might look like. So thank you very much for that, Ian. One key thing, what we need to do now is hear from you guys about really what are the biggest challenges? What are the blockers for you at the moment? Because we need to have the key thing around this is we don't want to be patting ourselves on the back on this event. We want to be really getting to the nub of what the challenges are. So if you wouldn't mind answering what this poll is here, and then we're going to move swiftly into the next discussion. So I'm now very happy to introduce Chris Tyus, Chair of GS1, who's going to talk to us now really about how this shift can happen. What do we need to do how should we be organizing, and how, very importantly, should this be funded? Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you, I think, to Ian for what was a most interesting introductory speech, and some of the background that he brought and some of the key figures were, I think, very helpful indeed. Maybe just a few words as we go into this panel to almost focus a little bit from the broader things that Ian talked about. But we're at a point where trusted data and the efficient transmission of that data is probably more important than ever in our food supply chains. The demand for visibility of data has moved from being probably a requirement for businesses along the supply chain to a necessity, as legislators and consumers demand much greater transparency. Events of the last 18 months have placed the food industry, I've seen, and a number of our speakers have seen, in the spotlight with a level of interest that's never, ever been seen before. Consumers want to know the provenance of the products they consume. They want to know where the materials come from, who produced it, under what conditions, how was it transported, and what was the impact for the environment. Legislators, on the other hand, want to ensure the safety of our food wherever we consume it, with proper labelling that can keep consumers safe. It's probably rather poignant that we meet just 2 weeks before the implementation of Natasha's Law. Natasha's Law will enshrine in legislation the sharing, and most importantly, the communication of key attributes relating to a product's components. The proportion of the population affected by allergies is increasing, and the link between diet and health is a key focus at a time when public health is understandably at the top of government's agenda. The publication just a few weeks ago of Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy has been a major part of this, but within it, it goes further in the proposal of a national data bank for food that will be used to judge the performance of the entire industry: growing, manufacturing, retailing, transportation. And then just to add to that, in 6 weeks' time, we have the COP26 summit, which will meet in Glasgow, and the impact of food on climate change and the environment, as Ian took us through, is certain to be a major topic. So responding to these challenges is only going to be possible for food as an end-to-end industry, and I come back to those words of end-to-end, manufacturing, retailing, transportation, growing. It's only going to be possible with a reliable base data that can be communicated seamlessly up and down the supply chain. And critically, this requires the collaboration and coordination of the entire industry. I just talked through a second ago. Both within this country and, as Ben spoke about earlier on, our many suppliers from across the world. So the key questions for, I think, session are: how should this be done? Who should coordinate it? And how it should be funded? They're key questions, and I'm delighted that our speakers today have the experience to really kick off that debate. So I'd like to introduce, first of all, Jan Goodsall, Dean of the School of Business and Economics, as well as Professor of Operations and Supply Chain at Loughborough University. And then colleague Ian Wright, the CEO of the Food and Drink Federation. So I think perhaps I'd ask Ian to start off answering some of these questions, and perhaps just pose a point, Ian. We've seen that industry come together like never before at the height of COVID. It's quite rightly applauded in many cases. As we heard, we still have significant challenges to address as an industry. So how can we achieve a similar magnitude of change without the global pandemic to unite us?
Well, Chris, that's a big question. I mean, I think we have to say that the industry performed astonishingly well during COVID, not just in the UK, actually globally. And the fact that we were able to get through the most challenging 18 months in terms of individual concerns and the collective shock to the way we live our lives is a pretty big testament to all those people, the 4 million people who work in our industry in the UK, who went to work every day at some risk to themselves, I think. At least at the start, I think we do face a really significant challenge now. And you and I were on a call earlier this morning where we literally talked about in about half an hour, we covered labour shortages, Northern Ireland, changes to import legislation, and COVID. And just that laundry list of challenges tells you how significant the difficulties facing the industry are right now. And I particularly highlight, given that we're talking about resilient supply chains, the very serious challenges that the current labour shortages that we see in our industry pose for the supply of food and drink to everybody. I've been quite I've been criticised a bit for my contention that just in time is over. I truly believe that we cannot sustain the just in time supply chain process or practice that has underpinned our food industry for the last 40 years. And I would just give you one example of that. In hospitality right now, 1 in 5 deliveries doesn't arrive. So hospitality, 20% of the orders they make of suppliers do not arrive. Now, in hospitality, that is relatively easy to mask because it's, as it were, behind the menu. But if that happened in supermarkets, 1 in 5 aisles would be empty. And we'd have we wouldn't just have panic buying, we'd have people sort of queuing around the block to get their products. And I think one of the issues that, to get to your point, the issue that is at risk, or the issue that seems to me to most concern, should be of most concern, is that we simply don't have the data to understand how these problems have arisen and why they have arisen. And therefore we don't have the solutions. And my colleagues in other trade associations reach for the immediate solution of get extra visas and shortage occupation lists and all that kind of stuff. Well, it's all quite helpful, but in the end, we need the data. And that's why Henry's call for a digital twin of the industry to be established as quickly as possible to help us with all of this is so crucial. Now, the question of who pays is obviously a really difficult one. I do think we have to be collaborative. I think the industry will have to play a role in this. And that's a big challenge for the industry, which is so hard pressed with very, very narrow margins. And that's going to get worse as supermarket ownership, which represents 80% of our sales, changes, and as American private equity takes over the big 4 supermarkets, which I think we will see over the next few years, probably 3 of the 4 at least. But we are going to have to find the space in the P&L to do this. We're going to have to share our data in a way we haven't done before. But if we do that, the prize is huge, because it does allow us to understand much more effectively how this works. And I know that the sort of digital twin, the emerging benefits that a digital twin approach can bring into the industry really are worth the price. Sorry, that was a very long answer to your question.
Thanks very much, Ian. I'd like to come back to perhaps the 2 issues of cost and coordination in a few moments. But can I bring Jan in for a second? Because particularly we talked about this end-to-end supply chain. In other words, not just manufacturers, not just retailers, not just growers, but that whole end-to-end and that importance of the end-to-end together and of the digital twin across it. Now, how, when you look at supply chain strategy, does that pan out, bringing all those different elements together, and how could we do it?
Okay, thanks a lot, Chris. And perhaps I'm going to build on something that Ian said. So I think, and both Ians actually, Ian Noble in his sort of keynote laid out a picture about why food and drink are so critical to life, and they really are. And so therefore we really have a moral responsibility in the UK to ensure that we can make sure that everyone in the UK has access to those critical to life products at a true cost, and that's a cost that actually represents what it really costs to produce that food and drink, in a way that is both sustainable and ensures a fair return to all of those different parties in the chain. So the consumer pays a fair price, equally everyone else across that end-to-end supply chain also gets a fair return too. Now, actually, some of that benefit will come from actually operating an end-to-end supply chain, and by understanding consumer demand, whether that be through a direct consumer route through a supermarket, or more indirectly through food services. And so for the last 20 years or so, a lot of my work around really looking at supply chain productivity has been around understanding demand patterns, because Ian Wright raises a very good point when he talks about just in time. To be fair, for the majority of our food products, demand is relatively stable and can be quite accurately forecast using some quite advanced planning systems underpinned by digital technologies. And if we actually find that stable demand and look at it across the end-to-end supply chain, we're not planning just in time, because actually we're creating a stable base that everybody in the supply chain can respond to. And if you look at some retailer strategies, but also people like McDonald's, then that is the type of strategy that they have deployed. And it's also why, for instance, in the case of someone like McDonald's, you know, they have had a large number of their suppliers, I think it's over 75%, that have been with them over 25 years. So some of this is actually about smart supply chain planning and trying to find that stable demand, not messing about with that stable demand, so that we're not planning just in time. We're actually planning in we're using our digital systems to be able to keep that underlying demand filled in a very effective and efficient way. The issue that we have at the moment is that sometimes we become siloed. So perhaps we look, as a retailer, you may look to optimize retail operations. As a manufacturer, you may look to optimize your manufacturing operations. And perhaps as a farmer, I was married to a dairy farmer for over 15 years, but perhaps you look to optimize your own operation. And if we're going to really create that stable base, in a way, we require that better supply chain integration. And I think whether it be a full digital twin or whether it just be, I would argue that the first step is at a simpler level, more around a planning system level. If we can try to understand true customer demand, not do things to mess about with that demand. So think very, very carefully if at the front end we truly want to mess around with that demand signal by running promotions and things, and then use an integrative planning system to try to optimize across the end-to-end. And those systems exist. Will go a long, long way to moving away from just in time to making sure that for many of those critical items, we can meet that base level of demand. And the critical thing that requires is perhaps a mindset shift, because, and this is not a criticism of retailers by any extent, but obviously retailers have to compete against each other at that end where they're in conjunction with the consumer. But some of the decisions made at that end, because that's the head of the supply chain, really set the tempo for the rest of the supply chain and can either set a stable base that everyone can respond to, or create more demand volatility that makes it harder.
Okay, thanks, Jan. Can we pick up maybe your point there about silos? And I think we'd also that we do have good examples of planning systems in silos between some manufacturers and some retailers. We have good point-to-point solutions, but what they don't do is to bring everybody into the loop. And it doesn't allow the burgeoning SME community who've grown so much in the food industry in the last 18 months to really participate in that. And this is where the digital twin that Ian talked about so much ago, with an open system, could give the opportunity. The problem with an open system is it needs to be coordinated. So perhaps here, before we get a precursor to the question of cost is who coordinates it. So what, Ian, what do you think is the role of government, and what is the role of industry itself coordinating this this initiative?
Well, I think that the first thing to say is that we have to make a decision about whether this is UK-wide or whether it is simply whether it's how the devolved administrations play in this. My own view would be that unless you have a UK-wide approach to this, it is going to be extremely difficult to get the value from the investment that will have to be made. And I realise that is going to be a challenge, particularly as it relates to Scotland, I think. But let's assume we can get past that devolved administration issue. My approach would be that the government needs to sponsor it, but not manage it. I think it's important. We've seen through the COVID crisis that actually the industry, the food and drink industry, in its widest possible sense, so if we take it from farm to fork, has been able to work together in a way that it never did probably since 1945. And we have been able to avoid, to a large degree, the kind of anti-competitive concerns that you would have thought at the start of the crisis might bedevil that collaborative approach. I don't think it needs to be a DEFRA-owned or a government-owned process, but I do think there is the potential for the government to create some kind of multiple ownership or multiple stakeholder body to own the work. And I think there are examples of that existing elsewhere. I mean, actually, as you know, Chris, I'm co-chair of the Food and Drink Sector Council. And indeed, my next meeting is of the Food and Drink Sector Council. And I do think the Sector Council could play a role in all of this, but it would need to be a facilitating and enabling role with some budget attached, but it would have to be something, in my view, that involves the collaboration of all parts of the supply chain. So it will have to involve everything from farm to fork, and crucially take in the logistics industry, because 45% of UK road and rail journeys, commercial road and rail journeys, are for food, and the packaging industry, because 70% of packaging is for food. So we need that. And I would argue that if we'd had this already, many of the labour problems that we're now seeing would have been identifiable, because none of them are, in my view, it's wrong to say they're the consequence of Brexit or COVID. These are the accelerations of changes which were already in train, and we just didn't spot them. And had we had this facility to consult the digital twin, we might have seen the problems coming, and we might have been able to do something about them.
Yeah. Thanks, Ian. I think that phrase there that you coined, of sponsor not manage, be a watchword that we use through. Just before we come to the issue of cost and savings them together, maybe just, you raised some important parts too about other industries that are a part of this, like packaging and logistics. So maybe I just respect Jan's thoughts on that area, bringing in all of this really end to end that she's spoken so eloquently about in the past.
So I think so there is a slight dilemma here, which is I very much think we need to try and optimize supply chains end to end. But the critical thing to bear in mind when wherever you sit in the supply chain is that your customer is the entity directly in front of you in the chain, and you're having to respond to their demand signal. So the end-to-end piece is about trying to coordinate that so that we have this, hopefully, stable underlying base demand. And you can see, as I said before, how some retailers' strategies or actually some food services providers' strategies enable that stable base, and then they enable each person to respond to the chain in front. There are new software solutions now. I suppose whether you call it a digital twin or whether you would just call it a multi-enterprise planning system, these solutions exist. But, and I think they become more affordable and accessible to many parties if they can buy into them as software as a service. Some of the barriers we've seen, though, is, and this is where it can get difficult, is there can be a difference between who pays the cost and who gets the benefit. And so this is where I suppose when these systems come about, you need to think about that fair return. But I'm involved in an Innovate UK project. So this is a good source of funding for anyone on this call. And this is a situation where we're using Made Smarter innovation funding through the CR&D call to actually looking at developing a collaborative platform that perhaps takes out some of the tension that normally exists when we try to do this into organisational planning, because cost and fighting about cost between procurement departments can become an issue. To build on a comment that one of the participants in the chat has focused on, which is carbon. So we wonder, because a lot of lack of trust, perhaps a supplier that feels exploited by their customer, and that happens at multiple echelons across the chain, whether that be a farmer feeling exploited by a processor, or a manufacturer feeling exploited by a retailer or food service provider, or perhaps even retailers struggling to meet the demands of consumers. But perhaps if we start to try to optimize around carbon, and factoring in the cost of carbon, and trying to ensure that we're designing our supply chains to be lowest carbon, that in a way takes away some of the tension of the financial negotiations we see around cost. But maybe also we need the metrics within individual firms to change, because, for instance, if you're a buyer for an organisation and you're remunerated and bonused on gross margin, that in itself will drive a set of behaviours that have consequences for the entire supply chain. So I think software as a service has an opportunity to allow people to join in. I am not sure that there needs to be any one party that coordinates it, and actually, depending on what type of ledger system you use, whether it's a more distributed ledger system, there's checks and balances within the way that that operates, that means that it's not necessarily one person that manages or coordinates a supply chain. But I think many of the issues that are stopping people sharing their data in the first place come to something that's more fundamental around trust. And people are scared, or that if they share their data, they're going to be exploited.
Thanks, Jan. And particularly, I think, for raising the issue there of the savings appearing in different slots, often to where the costs come in. And I think that's, there's a lot of debate coming on the chat and a lot of questions coming up around that point. So I think there are two questions to, how do we encourage people to invest in this when the savings may not necessarily be occurring in their area? And then how do we make sure that even software and everybody in the industry comes together to make this an open system that everybody can see, and the role that standards apply in that? Can I go back first of all to that cost? How do we encourage people to invest? Where does that cost come from when you may not necessarily see the savings? Ian, I think you've had quite a bit of experience with things like the apprenticeship levy, where people put in an amount of money and may receive money back depending upon what they do themselves. Is this an answer? Is something like the levy, the apprenticeship type levy, a digital levy, is that an answer for the years to come?
Well, the levy, I think, in its initial concept has been a sort of partial success. Some businesses just see it as a tax, pay it, and don't do anything with it. And I think that is obviously something we don't want to see. Where it could be a pointer, I think, is where you've got this idea of the levy, the money raised being available up and down the individual business's supply chain. So you effectively get a situation where a big company can parcel out or can indicate where it would like the levy spent by some of its suppliers, or indeed by some of its customers, to add to the value of that supply chain. And I think that is a very interesting approach. Again, it needs government sponsorship, but it doesn't need government management once that's established. The second area where I think there is a big opportunity is in the use of the tax system, but rather in the use of it as a facilitator. So I'm a huge fan of R&D tax credits. Funnily enough, I was at dinner last night where the R&D tax credit, or a consultancy which makes its entire living and has got about 200 people, was sponsoring the occasion. Now, what that tells you is it's incredibly complex, and you know, even strong-minded managers weep at the amount of paperwork and bureaucracy that R&D tax credits require. So we would need to simplify, but I do think there are some big opportunities, and there are quite a lot of funds available actually, if you know where to look. So I think what you suggest, Chris, is that there are ways already in existence, or at least there are pointers to the value of collaboration. And, you know, there are opportunities where businesses have collaborated quite effectively over the last couple of years, but we are going to need to generate a sort of step change in the trust up and down the sector in order to be able to do the kind of work at the scale, and scale is the key here, at the scale that we need to transform the industry's ability to plan.
I think that's encouraging, Ian. In terms of the cost, the two tools, whether it be the R&D tax and the partial success kind of apprenticeship levy type of approach, if used through the industry. The food and drink industry is quite unique in terms of the number of different players it has, and particularly growers and the increasing number of small businesses. And I think we've all seen the supply chains almost become democratized recently by the number of different delivery outlets there and the success of them. But are there any lessons that we can learn, Jan, from other industries?
Yeah, I'm just noticing that chain of thought. I think so. So, for instance, if you look at the construction industry, which you could argue, gosh, what's food supply chains got to do with construction? One of the things that they've done, if you imagine a big construction project has a very complex chain, and one of the things that they've done is to develop approaches. If you look at something like Heathrow Terminal 5, they had a behavioural contract, so it's a very different sort of contract that looked at how they both shared risk and reward into one pool, tried to minimise cost across the end. In their case, it was a project. And then at the end, they would then basically share out basically through the efficiency gains, the money they then saved in the sort of pot of money at the end, they then divvied back out across the chain. So I do wonder whether or not there is a different way of perhaps contracting or thinking about, again, it comes down to thinking about this base level of demand for the majority of products and thinking about how we might contract for that in a different way that encourages everyone to work together and to share the risk, but equally to share the reward. I think there are some new, if we also think about manufacturing, just manufacturing more generally, I think one of the things that we believe will happen going forward is that we'll see a return to what we call more distributed manufacturing, which is essentially what we see already within food and drink, which you talked about food and drink becoming more federated. So rather than necessarily competing through large factories with economies of scale, and equally you can see that in terms of then the route to market for food and drink products, it may not necessarily be through, there's many more options too. That the critical thing becomes here is more the platforms then that create those connections between a demand for a product or a food product or service and the way it can be supplied. And that could lead to a lot of disintermediation. So perhaps direct from farm or direct from producer, and may cut out some of the more traditional routes to market, but equally create new ones. So I think in a way that in itself levels up the field, because if we have platforms that enable those connections, it's less about how big or small you are, or more traditional roles in the supply chain, but it's more about what service you provide within that chain or network. So I think food and drink could be perhaps more innovative in how it looks to some of the other industries in terms of addressing some of these issues, because it is a product that is critical to life.
Yes, and I think you finished there with a very important point. It is something that we come in contact with every single day. Every single person has an interest in food, whether it's from their health, whether it's from the environment, from the success of a business that employs, as said, nearly 4 million people in its total. And the environmental aspect is becoming an increasingly important one. So I suppose almost to sort of finish that question, how much is, to it first, but with COP26 coming up, how much is that environment the real going to be the final facilitator or the final catalyst to ensure that we have this digital twin, providing that data and ensuring that we have informed consumers?
And just to quickly jump in, just to keep the drumbeat going, if we could keep this one nice and punchy, because then we're going to be moving to the next panel discussion. But yeah, please do go ahead. Thanks.
Do you want me to go first on that, Chris?
Ian, thanks.
I think the net zero agenda is going to be a major influence on the way that our industry organizes itself. My only concern about relying on that being the catalyst is that I just think there is so much of everything else in the way. And I am a bit worried, as I know others are, that a lot of we've all committed to net zero by 2040 in effect. But a lot of that activity, I'm really bothered that we get to about 2027, where we've all done stuff. And then we all start pointing at each other going, well, the rest of it's over to you, mate. And I can see that beginning to happen already. So that's one of the reasons that I think we need government to hold the ring on this, because I think they're in a better position to threaten those who don't step up to the mark than peer pressure is. The other way, of course, that might happen is by the major customers, supermarkets, being pretty serious about people meeting their commitments and therefore driving this kind of approach. And if the supermarkets do play that role, I think that would be something of a help.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Having had my knuckles wrapped there for disturbing Ben's timetable, perhaps I can conclude a little bit, Jan, sorry, at this stage. But I'd take the last point that Ian made and which Jan coined from the beginning, that this has, I think, from this interesting debate over the last 35 minutes, this has to be an end-to-end approach. It cannot be silos, as Jan was saying earlier. It probably needs to be supervised but not managed by government, but the industry has proved that it can pull together in the right circumstances. In terms of the important points about cost, there are some of the tools already existing, things like R&D tax credits, the digital levy based maybe on the apprenticeship levy that could be used, but it does need everybody to come together in it. But we probably have the foundations there. It just now needs that impetus. And whether that's sustainability, whether that's health, whether that's the business as a whole, or bringing together all of those, I think we have to see in the coming months. But there really is an urgency for that digital twin. So I hope everybody's found that last 40 minutes interesting. I'll now hand back to Ben for the next part of the agenda.
Chris, thank you so much. And yeah, absolutely fascinating discussion. Thanks, Jan, Ian, as well for that. And there are many questions in the list. So what we're going to be doing is we'll be responding as we send the feedback from the event. We'll be answering those questions as part of that. But it's very clear that UK is in a very great position to be able to do some or drive this agenda forward. And the next panel, which was going to be chaired by Rudiger Hagedorn from the Consumer Goods Forum, he's the Director of End-to-End Supply Chain. We'll be just looking at how the UK can actually leverage what we're best at and what are the key areas of good success that we've done so far. So Rudy, over to you and to introduce the rest of the panel. Thanks, Rudy.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Hello, everybody. And please watch at my analog green screen. So just for a change, no background picture, no blur. This is how it looks like. We have a very special panel looking into how can the UK food and drink industry lead the way And there's a good way to approach this and giving different levels of entry with small and medium enterprises, bigger enterprises, and also there are lots of initiatives going on in the UK, and we want to shed some light on them in order to give you insights where you might be able to support and where you might be able to join. In order of appearance on my screen, I would like to sum it up. Mr. Tom Holland, Innovation and Technical Director at Rayner's Foods. Hello, Tom. To you. We have Mrs. Wendy Herrick, Vice President, Digital Supply Chain at Unilever. Good morning. I know it's very early.
Good morning, Rudy. Good morning, Tom.
Yes, hello. And Mr. Tom Rose, Global Operations Director at Spar International.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. And thank you for supporting me in getting this across. We're looking at the UK. We had an excellent introduction about what is happening. And the key thing for a company would be, how can I get closer to digital? What does digital mean? And I would like to start with Tom Holland. Talking small and medium enterprise, Tom, talking digital. Could you highlight some activities that you are aware of and shed some light on them for us?
Yeah, sure. So our business, Rayner Foods, is leading a consortium of 11 UK-based entities to deliver a project called the Digital Sandwich. And this is a £10 million project with £4 million worth of funding coming from Innovate UK through Made Smarter for a 2-year project. And we're looking at exploiting a number of digital technologies, such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, digital twins, zero trust technology, Internet of Things, and various other new emerging bits of tech. And we're pulling them all together in terms of digital fusion. The output is a major piece of software which will allow food and drink businesses to connect online and share valuable data and generate valuable insights. And of course, retail have a pivotal role in this, in sharing their data both up and downstream. Importantly, the platform which we're developing will allow SMEs who don't usually have access to this technology to benefit and to plug in. And Rayner Foods will then become a UK demonstrator for these technologies. I think one of the key parts of our project is we're looking at trying to leverage the value in the supply chain, almost through a derivative structure, which will allow people to tap in and enter onto the platform with zero cost to try and de-risk it for them.
Thank you very much, Tom. I think these are really encouraging words, especially noticing that there's also some part taken care of for the small and medium enterprises. Talking about big chains and international supply chains, from a Spar perspective as a retailer, where do you see the opportunities as supply chains are digitized? And what is AIVO? Can you tell us a little bit more about it? Thank you.
Okay, I'll tell you a little bit about that. At Spar, we believe we are better together. And our name comes from the first letters of the Dutch phrase. In English is through united collaboration, everybody benefits. And opportunities do exist, and they've been mentioned with digital in things like automation, robotics, in forecasting and demand planning, and in our internal processes. But these are still in our silos. The bigger opportunity is how we look at product flow through the end-to-end supply chain. And in my world, end-to-end is the end of the production line through to the shelf in the store. Although you can think bigger from field to fork, okay? But that obviously adds a lot more complexity. Across Spar countries, and our suppliers, we constantly explore the opportunities to remove cost and to make our supply chains more efficient. In South Africa, our supply chain flow analysis led with one of the big FMCG suppliers to new routing, new ways of ordering, and new timings for deliveries that took overall 30% out of the operating costs of the supply chain, okay, just by changing the way in which we work together. In the Netherlands, we've worked with a number of our chilled suppliers to have dynamic routing. So we changed the order process, the order timings, the preparation times, and the dispatch times, so that on busy days, those deliveries can come straight into our DC in full loads. But on quieter days, we can collect them in a route so that we remove transport. And we've taken a significant number of trucks off the road every week by merging those deliveries in the inbound transit flow. And in the UK, we've worked with leading FMCG suppliers, again, on dynamic routing of lines, drinks lines that when on promotion and high volumes, they're delivered directly to our stores. So we collect from the manufacturer on our own vehicles and deliver them. But on quieter days, those same collections come back into our DC to go on consolidated loads. So looking at how you're constantly working to remove activity. People will tell you supply chains are complicated, and they are, but the principles are relatively the same. Handle things as little as possible, move them the shortest distance possible, and when you have to handle them or move them, make sure it's as full as possible. Okay, that's how you reduce your overall costs. Digitization of the supply chain and data give us the ability to do far more and get far more insights, because all of a sudden, data and the commonality of that data then through big data analytics, we can get insights to those things that took us weeks of analysis, we can get in days. So we can become much more responsive. And who knows, one day we'll actually be able to optimize in real time, okay, as orders are being placed on a day. But the real opportunity is cross-industry collaboration, okay? We're all great in our own individual silos, but why do we have the situation where FMCG suppliers and retailers follow each other around from one town to the next town doing their deliveries? Why don't we have all the deliveries to one town coordinated on one truck to remove unnecessary transport, waste of unnecessary space in vehicles and on pallets? And that's where we come to something like AI Evo. AI Evo is an industry-wide project in the UK, looking at bringing together data visibility across the industry. And through that data visibility across the industry and the analytics it can give us, is where you really start to see the opportunities of working together. Because if we work together across an industry, we can take out the truck movements. We don't need more truck drivers, just take out the truck movements, okay? You can improve all parts of your process, and the less you handle it, the less you move it, and the fuller it is, the less cost we add into the food supply chain.
So thank you, Tom. And also thank you, Tom, for looking into the digital part and how things can be dealt with. And now we'll move through the lens of a manufacturer. And there's one company I'm really proud to announce, London-based, very traditional, Wendy. I know you have a digital agenda. And would you be able to share a little bit about Unilever's digital agenda with us?
Sure. Thanks. And it really feeds into Tom and Tom's previous discussion as well. I mean, when we say the word digital, it means a lot of different things to different people. And for us, it actually means it's not just the technology, it's the processes, it's the people side of the agenda. And of course, there's technology involved in that. And when we've looked across the globe, I mean, we service 2.5 billion consumers every day, and they're our most important stakeholder. We're all in business to try and satisfy and exceed the needs of the consumer. And in order to do that, they have expectations of us. So our purpose in Unilever is to make sustainable living commonplace, and to enable that, as Tom just alluded to, that collaboration, not even across industries, it's across the ecosystem, everything that we do. And he called it farm to fork. I call it from commodity to the consumer. But every piece of the pie in between, you have to look at how to optimize it. And that's where we talk to digital. And the UK, of course, it is our, one of our heritage markets, is so incredibly important, but it's also quite mature. I mean, our customers in the UK and what we're doing there digitally, not only to share data, but to optimize processes and to be more sustainable is critical. And also our supplier side, tracing all our materials from commodity and farm. So you look at that sustainability arm to it, but then exceeding the quality standards that our consumers expect. And in the UK, we have pretty tough consumers of their expectations of us. So that digital transformation not only includes data, but we're doing things in our factories. You know, we make some of the best ice cream in the world out of Gloucester, and it's a very, very digitized factory. And what we do with maintenance and predictive maintenance, but measuring every piece of equipment and what it does every second, and streaming real-time data to make sure there's no waste, but also we turn out an incredibly quality product for the consumers. Super, super important to us. What we've done in our Port Sunlight factory as well, we call it DFOS, but it is the digital twin inside the factory. You know, that was one of our star factories coming out of the UK. And what we do with our partners there as well, like I said, we have incredibly, not only collaborative, but very, very mature customers that sit there, and the data that we share and how we get real-time data with regards to being able to deliver an MOQ of 1, you know, so it's not, we're not talking about pallets and cases anymore. We're talking about individual units. You know, we're a traditional business. We've been around for 100 years. And, you know, that mass distribution, mass production just doesn't exist anymore. And the UK has really helped us, I think, drive models that will service the consumer in a very sustainable way as we move forward. But more importantly, that word digital and what it means to everyone, data is underlying. And Rudy, you know this from the Consumer Goods Forum and the work that we do with GS1. So incredibly important that we make that foundation of data across the ecosystem so we can share, we can optimize, we can drive waste out, and most importantly, meet the consumer needs.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. Yeah, and true. I think to make everything interoperable is one of the key objectives, right? So data sharing is good, but we need to talk the same language in order to actually exchange. We are going to the final round, and maybe we need to be a little bit shorter because I see Ben already popping up with a stern look. So going back to Tom, the digital sandwich, Tom. And if somebody wants to get close to digitizing, what is most likely she or he will encounter as barriers or enablers with regard to digital? Could you give some hints?
I think for me, you were breaking up, sir, when you were talking, but I think I got the gist of what you were saying. You know, innovating, you know, being an SME innovating in the UK, yes, as an SME, we have a number of barriers, but also there's actually quite a few enablers innovating in the UK. So I think one of the key barriers that we have is trying to develop our in-house knowledge. You know, that can be achieved through KTPs and various other schemes like that. We want to, as we're introducing digital technologies into our processes, into our factory, and effectively into our supply chain, we also need to start training our operators and moving them from being an operator to becoming technicians, to upskill them as well. I think capital expend, or the cost of the innovation project, is a very key part for us. We wouldn't have been able to do it without Innovate UK and them able to provide a grant for us to de-risk it. So that's very, very important as well. I think also the UK has a fantastic ecosystem, a great partnership to build new relationships and to develop new technologies. It's quite forward thinking in that respect. You know, the UK might not be the biggest country out there, but we can definitely be the most agile as well. And I think also having the correct infrastructure is in place as well. You know, we're fortunate, UK is a small island. Its supply chain is quite well connected as well. And this presents us a good opportunity to test run some of this technology before eventually, you know, exporting out of the UK. So, you know, from our perspective, the UK is an excellent place to innovate and to progress these digital opportunities.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. And I would like to catch on one sentence you just said, which is exporting. Wendy, when it comes to exporting out of the UK, and you being a global company, could you share some learnings? Where can UK lead the way?
Like I just alluded to, Rudy, in our factories, but also in our collaboration with partners. You know, we have a program called Partner with Purpose, and some of that was born out of the UK and being able to partner. And you talked about, you know, when we looked at our digital agenda, we looked at it in 3 slices, and partnerships and people were super critical. And if we look at the talent that we have in the UK, but also the partnerships we have in the UK, I think it's a breeding ground to drive innovation and proof of concept across Unilever, and it has done. I talked a little bit about the factories, you know, the customers that we're working with and in sharing data, and how we service the consumer is really driving some of our digital agenda across Unilever. So it has been a breeding ground, but the people side of it is super important in having that talent. And I think the universities there and the businesses in the UK have really invested in their people, but they've also invested in their partnerships. And those are 2 critical enablers to any digital agenda. And the UK is doing it, and we've got lots of proof of concept going on there.
Yeah, thank you. I really love it. This is a big shout out, I think, for academia listening to us here now. It's good to talk about digital, but we need the skills and the people. Don't forget the people driving the digital agenda. Thank you, Wendy. And maybe Tom, to wrap it up, from a retail perspective, putting on the UK lens, does the UK have an advantage? And if so,
absolutely,
where?
Absolutely, it does. Although I'm just going to pick up a little bit on what Wendy and you just said about people and skills first. You know, I work with a number of data analysts, and the key is not people that can punch data, not people that can use Python. It's people that understand the data, and the more people understand what missions they want from the data, the better quality you get, rather than just analysis. Okay, so the skills of our people are vitally important. Back to the UK, I want to pick up something Tom said, and that was really about the geography of the UK. You know, most routes are relatively short, and a high proportion of deliveries are same day. You know, from picking in the warehouses through to delivery are same day operations, because the island is fairly small. With these short, more defined routings than we have in mainland Europe, the opportunities that come from those insights should be clearer. The analytics can give more defined answers, which will allow people to refine those techniques, define the goals, get alignment on them, and implement them much more quicker than the longer leg supply chains that we have in Northern Europe, but also across many other countries in the world. But the challenge will be not the working within our own silos. That will give us lots of benefit. It's how we look at cross industry and how we start to actually all talk the same language. And the work with GS1, you know, on industry standards is vitally important to that, because we actually all need to talk a similar language to be able to get clarity on the data and the analytics.
Thank you, Tom. I think we arrived at a closed session now. Looking at Wendy, Tom, and Tom, anything I forgot to ask you? All good? Ben, you can appear, and I'm not afraid. I'm on time, actually.
You've been exactly.
Thank you.
Perfect timing. Thank you. And I think there's a couple of interesting questions as well that have come from the audience. I mean, one here from Helen for you, Tom. Hear about how did you make the step change from a sandwich business to embrace innovation and the level of risk that you've done? Yeah, how did you go about on that journey? What was the kind of main incentive for you to make that leap?
I think you know, the business took a cold, long, hard look at what the future looks like over the next 5 to 10 years. Bear in mind, it is a family business, second generation. And it identified that, yeah, the current business model would not work if we carried on as we are. And so we went out there initially, it's around the 2-year fact-finding tour to go out, understand what the new digital technologies, what opportunities they present to us, who we could work with. So we partnered with the University of Lincoln, and we came quickly through across the digital catapult, and we created an ecosystem who shared similar values, and we all walked forward together because we had a good alignment of interests and values. I think if we don't change and we don't evolve, then we won't have a business in 5-10 years.
Well, that's an excellent incentive to embrace change. Okay, great. So and thank you for that, Tom. And then another question, just about the skills gap, because we've talked about the importance of skills, and already mentioned in the previous panel around the apprenticeship levy and so on. What more can be done, do you think, to support the right skills coming to the right parts of the food system to enable this adoption? Yeah, are there any other comments that anybody has on that?
I think for me, it would be industry engagement. You can teach coding skills, you can teach analytic skills, but it's creating the understanding of that. Okay, so the real world understanding. So actually, when I'm analysing the flow of product, I can actually start to pin together the solutions that will give most value, rather than just producing a whole load of data that then somebody else has to try and make sense of. So it's how do we get to the point of understanding of context of the coding and the analytics that's being done.
I think, yeah, maybe if I can just come in, people talked about interoperability, and people talked about the same language. And the more we can make systems open by having common standards, keeping people talking the same language, we make it easier from a people aspect. The more times that we have different systems working on closed systems that are point to point, we make it much harder from the human aspect, and at the same time much more expensive as well. So that interoperability is speaking the same language, the common standards that people talked about earlier, is absolutely critical in the people dimension.
Absolutely, thank you, thanks, Chris. Is there anything, Wendy, that you think we could learn from other parts of the world when it comes to great examples of enabling digital adoption?
Ben, there is, we learn from across the globe. There's every country, or we call them clusters, PMUs, marketing units, or whatever. They bring their own, their own processes to the table, right? Because the consumer and markets are different. I mean, if you look at what happened in Asia, that was, it's still a D&E market. A lot of D&E markets are there for us, but they actually leapfrogged in the digital space because every consumer has a phone already. So they didn't go to the computer side of it. It was like they totally, in Indonesia, it's like everyone has a phone and they're already doing direct to consumer. Whereas a lot of us, like the UK or the US, we had it as a stepping stone. So we can definitely learn from other markets with regards to how we leapfrog in the digital space and how we think differently, because incremental steps in digital isn't going to have you win with the consumer in the marketplace, but those exponential ones will. So I would say whether you're a mature market and you have an ecosystem where you can really pilot and do proof of concepts in the digital foray, or whether you're in a D&E market, you can absolutely get different learnings from across the globe.
Fantastic, thank you, Wendy. That's really important, and because obviously our supply chains are global, our perspectives should be too. So that's really helpful. Just so at this phase now, we really, I think we've covered most of the questions for this panel. At this point, really, it's now looking forward. What do we need to do next? Because one of the things is obviously it's very easy for us to have excellent workshops and panel discussions and whatnot, but it's really about, well, how do we then move the needle and how do we best work going forward? One of the big challenges that Rudy was pointing out was around what do we look at in terms of the enablers and what are the key enablers for this adoption? One question within the UK, given that we've got a fairly well-structured well, it's a small country where we're able to comparatively, where there's a lot of opportunities, as Tom mentioned, for innovation in a bounded way. Enablers that we've been looking at around interoperability. It's been talking about data sharing and permissioning, and that's obviously a key kind of technical infrastructure that needs to be put in place. And the softest issues around skills development and so on are often many of the bigger challenges. But we talked earlier in the previous panel about the establishment of a mechanism to be able to enable this digital adoption. What do you think is important when it comes to the governance of a mechanism like this, and how should digitalization be governed when it comes to the platforms and industry involvement when looking at adoption of technology? So how important is it for industry to have a role and to have a voice in the design of programs for adopting digital technology? Tom, would you?
I think the industry's involvement is vital. But that's where, you know, GS1 and the great work they do, bringing different groups together, and the Consumer Goods Forum work that really leads on the value chain, are vital pieces of activity to ensure that we stay aligned as an industry. And let's be really careful here. You know, we don't all have to use the same systems. We don't all have to work in the same way, but we have to have some commonality to the standards and interchange of data so we can all talk the same language between each other. And that's the problem is, you know, at the moment, everybody develops individually in their own silos. We need to develop that commonality of language within data, okay, so that we can all interchange and we can all talk more freely. So those roles, I think, you know, GS1, Consumer Goods Forum, bringing the industry together in bodies to discuss the requirements and align on those are vital to us being able to do more at more speed.
Fantastic, thanks, Tom. And Wendy, from your perspective, I mean, how with the same question again, really, I mean, how important is the involvement in industry in shaping the strategy, but also in terms of how the data is governed, and what incentives can be generated from that data?
It's absolutely critical. I mean, that to me, it's not even a question. I mean, you know, Tom talked about GS1 and the Consumer Goods Forum, but I would say everyone that's involved in the ecosystem needs to come to the table to innovate together and understand how to make those connections, right? So as Tom pointed out, not everyone has to work in exactly the same way. I mean, a lot of us have systems that have been around for years, but I think, you know, even when we say industry, even the software industry and the technology industry and how we make connectivity possible versus very expensive is really important. And if you look at where technologies come, those connections are much easier. I mean, we've gone from, you know, basic sending spreadsheets and emails to each other to EDI, now to APIs, and that connectivity, but the data needs to speak to each other. So I think, again, when we say industry, I think it's the whole ecosystem that needs to come together to make that tick. Yeah.
Fantastic. And thank you, Wendy. No, absolutely. The entire ecosystem working together. And ultimately, this has to be for better business, for people to be able to run their businesses more effectively and generate optimal returns on, you know, the way they're optimizing their processes within their businesses. So thank you, everybody, for attending the event today. I'm just going to wrap up with some key next steps that we're going to be looking at following. The goal really for this work is just to begin a journey that we're looking at going on, and to do that in a way that is industry-led. We have many challenges across the food system, and one of the key things that we look at is how do we best leverage the innovation community to be able to work together to drive greater change. So we've talked a lot about the challenges and the opportunities, and in many ways there's a market failure that we've been looking at. And this is looking at how do we, in many ways, because information doesn't flow across the system, products and money are wasted, leaving society and the environment to pick up the tab, and the collaboration that needs to happen speaks very much to the point that Ian started us off with around we need to create this open and interoperable digitalized food system that is capable of responding to shock, food and drink system. And how we work and those that we partner with is very much looking at creating these interoperable assets and capabilities that can mobilize the excellent diversity of technology providers that we have here in the UK to meet industry needs, and very importantly, both large and small. So, from our perspective, the goal here is we want to use this event and to help inspire action that moves forward in line with the discussion that was had today. And so the next steps that we're going to be having is that the recording is going to be made available on YouTube. We're going to be sending that out to all of those signed up, also posting it online. We're then going to be, at the end of this event, immediately after this, we're going to be giving a feedback poll, which when the Zoom screen finishes, if you wouldn't mind just quickly filling in the poll, that will then help us make sure that we're improving what we're doing going forward. And then based on all of the content that we've discussed today, we're going to be issuing a questionnaire, which is going to be sent out to all of the participants. The goal being to really ensure that we're getting your voice in this discussion. And then based on those, the answers of those questionnaires, feel free to share them with your colleagues and peers and friends and whoever. We're then going to be running one or two or a series of roundtables, depending on the demand, which will then be able to help us form an action plan around what we need to do to go forward. How do we move the needle? How do we now enable the UK to lead the way when it comes to digitalizing supply chains? And as Ian said at the beginning, the time really is now to be able to do this. We have an amazing precedent of examples where technologies is being really well adopted and deployed. The technology is there, the technology is ready, and the market is now demanding it. It's our role now to be able to help bring those of you who want to go on the journey along that journey. So we very much hope to be able to continue this dialogue, this discussion, and most importantly, enable action around this over the next few months and years. So we're going to close this now. As I mentioned, we're going to be issuing all of the answers to questions that people have posted that we haven't been able to answer, and hoping to go on this journey with you all. So thank you all very much. And in the next 2 minutes before 12:30, please do fill in the feedback poll, and we'll very much look forward to sharing this journey with you. Thank you all very much.